The corral exploded into noise before Virginia Reed even touched the gate latch. 300 pounds of muscle, rage, and untamed fury threw itself against the fence rails so hard the whole structure shuddered, and every man standing along the perimeter took an involuntary step backward. Dust rose in thick curtains. The black stallion screamed, not whinnied, screamed, a sound like tearing iron, and his hooves struck the ground with the force of thunder rolling up through the soles of every boot in the yard. "Virginia, get away from that gate right now." The voice belonged to Cole Hatcher, foreman of the Brenner spread, a man who had worked cattle from Texas to Montana and had never once been called a coward. But he stepped backward too, because the animal inside that corral was not a horse anymore. It was a force of nature wearing a horse's skin, and it had already put 2 experienced wranglers in the dust this morning, one with a broken collarbone and one who simply hadn't gotten up yet. Virginia did not move away from the gate. She stood in her worn leather boots, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, her hands loose at her sides, and she watched the stallion with eyes that were completely, impossibly calm. The horse was circling the corral now, head high, nostrils flaring red, looking for something to destroy. "Miss Reed," another voice called from the rail, sharper this time, a voice she had been hearing and carefully ignoring all morning. "I'm telling you to step back." That was Wesley Brenner. He owned every acre of this land, every head of cattle, every post and rail in that corral, and right now he owned a problem he could not solve, and that last fact was written all over his face like a brand. Virginia turned her head just far enough to look at him. He was leaning on the top rail, both forearms down, his jaw set hard, and his dark eyes were fixed on her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression every man in Cook County, Nevada, gave her eventually. It was the expression that said she was a small, quiet rancher's daughter who had wandered somewhere she did not belong, and she should be redirected gently, like cattle that had drifted from the herd. She had been receiving that expression her entire 22 years of life. She turned back to the stallion. "I'll have him gentled inside an hour," she said quietly, and she lifted the gate latch. The collective intake of breath from every man along that rail could have filled a barn. Wesley Brenner pushed off the fence so fast the wood cracked under his palms. "Virginia Reed, do not open that," but she was already inside. The story of how Virginia Reed came to be standing inside a corral with the most dangerous horse in 3 territories, with Wesley Brenner's heart hammering against his ribs for reasons he had not yet allowed himself to examine, did not begin that morning. It began 4 months earlier, in the late spring of 1878, on the day her father's ranch ceased to exist. Elias Reed had worked the land outside Holt's Crossing, Nevada, for 18 years. He had built his herd from 11 head to nearly 300, had drilled 2 wells, had put up a proper house with a 2nd floor and glass windows that caught the evening light in a way that made Virginia's heart ache every time she thought about it now. He had done all of it with patient, steady hands and a mind that understood the land the way some men understood the Bible, deeply and personally, and with a kind of reverence that could not be faked. He had also, in his final year, made 2 terrible mistakes. The first was trusting the wrong man with a land deal that involved a promissory note Virginia had never seen until after it was signed. The second was dying before he could unravel the mess the first mistake had made. Elias Reed had a bad heart. He had known about it for years. He had not told Virginia, which was its own kind of betrayal, though she refused to call it that because he was her father and she loved him and he had thought he was protecting her. He was wrong about that too. The note came due in April. Virginia had 60 days to produce a sum she did not have, or the land reverted to the man holding the note, a cattle broker out of Carson City named Doyle Marsh, who had made a profession out of collecting parcels just like hers through exactly these kinds of arrangements. She had written to every bank in the county. She had written letters to men who had done business with her father. She had sat across from men in good suits who looked at her the way Cole Hatcher would later look at her across that corral, with that mixture of polite pity and fundamental dismissal that she had come to understand was simply the texture of her life, and they had told her nothing useful. She was Elias Reed's daughter. She was quiet, she was young, she was female, and she was alone. As far as Cook County was concerned, those four facts together constituted the whole of her situation, and her situation was unfortunate but clear. She should sell what she could, find a position somewhere reasonable, perhaps as a schoolteacher or a seamstress, and let the land go to someone who could do something with it. What Virginia Reed did instead was ride 30 miles north to the Brenner spread on a Tuesday morning in May and ask for work. She had heard about the situation with the wild Stallion before she got there. The horse had been captured in the canyon country west of the Ruby Mountains by a man named Pedersen, who had a contract to supply horses to the army. Pedersen was good at capturing horses. He was not good at gentling them, and this particular animal, a black Spanish-bred stallion with the bone structure of a king and the temperament of a lightning bolt, had resisted every method Pedersen tried. He had sold the horse to Wesley Brenner at a steep discount with a quiet honesty that Virginia respected when she heard about it later. Pedersen had told Wesley exactly what he was getting. Wesley had bought the horse anyway because Wesley Brenner was the kind of man who looked at a problem and saw an opportunity where other men saw only the problem. That was the first thing she learned about him that she filed away carefully in the back of her mind. The ranch itself was an operation of real scale. Wesley ran close to 800 head of cattle across land his father had homesteaded in 1858, and which Wesley had been expanding steadily since he took it over at the age of 26. He was 32 now. He had a foreman, 2 senior wranglers, 6 seasonal hands, a cook named Bet who ruled the kitchen like a military commander, and a reputation throughout 3 counties for running one of the cleanest, best-managed outfits in central Nevada. He did not, when Virginia rode up on her gray mare and asked to see the owner, come out to meet her himself. He sent Cole Hatcher. Cole Hatcher looked at her from under the brim of his hat with the professional blankness of a man who had learned to deliver bad news efficiently. We're not hiring, miss, not for domestic positions. Bet runs the house and she has everything she needs. Virginia had expected this. She had prepared for it. I'm not looking for domestic work, she said. I understand you have a horse you need gentled. I'd like to offer my services for that specific job. Cole Hatcher's professional blankness cracked, just for a moment, into something that was almost a smile. Not a kind smile. The kind of smile that appears when a person says something so far outside the expected range of conversation that the only response is a reflexive, involuntary twitch of the mouth. He recovered it quickly. The horse has put 2 experienced men on the ground, he said. I don't think that's work we'd be looking to put a young woman at. Then you'd be wrong about that, Virginia said pleasantly, and she asked him to please tell Mr. Brenner she was here, and she would wait as long as it took. She waited for an hour and 40 minutes. Wesley Brenner came out of the barn with his sleeves rolled up and a look on his face that said he had been in the middle of something more important than whatever this was. He was taller than she had expected from the description she had heard in town. Wide shoulders, dark hair, jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the Ruby Mountains, and eyes that were a deep, complicated brown that she noticed and immediately stored somewhere she would examine later, in private. He looked at her the same way Cole Hatcher had, but there was something else underneath it, an assessment. Not dismissal, not exactly, but the professional calculation of a man who was good at his work and who was trying to figure out what category she fit into. She had a feeling she was not going to fit into any of his categories. She had never fit neatly into anyone's categories, and she had stopped trying. Miss Reed, he said. He had a voice that carried without needing to be raised, the kind of voice that a ranch runs on. Cole tells me you want to gentle the black. I do. Why would I let you attempt that? She had thought carefully about this answer. She gave him the truth, because she had found in her experience that the truth delivered directly, and without apology was the most disorienting thing she could offer a man who expected her to be soft. Because no one else on this property has managed it. Because I have been gentling difficult horses since I was 14 years old, using methods that don't involve breaking their spirit or their body. And because I need the work. My father's land is under a note I'm trying to clear, and I need money to do it, and I'm willing to earn that money honestly. I thought that was something a man in your position would understand. Something shifted behind his eyes, not softened, sharpened. He was listening now in a different way than he had been a moment ago. What methods? He asked. She talked for 12 minutes. She talked about pressure and release, about reading a horse's body like a language, about the difference between submission and trust, and why the second one lasted and the first one always broke down under stress. She talked about her father's old mare, Persephone, who had been deemed unrideable by 2 men before Virginia was 15, and who Virginia had been riding bareback across open country before her 16th birthday. She talked about the specific signs of fear versus aggression in a horse's posture, in the angle of its ears, in the way it held its neck, and what those signs told you about what the animal needed and what approach it would tolerate. Wesley Brenner listened to the whole 12 minutes without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The job pays $15 if you gentle him to the point where I can handle him myself. It pays $20 if you get him to saddle broke." She could hear the skepticism under the offer. He expected her to fail. He was giving her the chance because something she had said had caught some small part of his attention, and because $15 was not a ruinous loss if she went home having accomplished nothing. $25 if he's fully broke and rideable by a working hand, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. $25, he agreed. She started the following Monday. The stallion's name, according to Peterson's paperwork, was listed only as black Spanish type unbroken approx. 7 years. The ranch hands had taken to calling him Devil, which Virginia thought was exactly the wrong approach, and she said so on her first morning. The horse heard his own name more than he heard anything else. If every time you spoke to something you called it by a name that meant danger and threat and punishment, you were teaching it something about itself that would be very hard to undo. She called him Shadow because he moved like one, quick and low and flickering, and because the name had no history of pain in it. She did not go into the corral the first day. She stood at the rail for 4 hours, just stood there. She watched him move, watched how he circled and how he held his head, and where his feet went when he was frightened versus when he was simply restless. She watched the way his left ear was slightly slower to come forward than his right, which told her there might be some residual soreness on that side, possibly from something Peterson's men had tried. She watched how he responded to the sounds of the ranch around him, to the other horses in the neighboring corral, to the distant sound of cattle, to the specific pitch of male voices. That last one was important. Shadow had a significantly stronger fear response to the sound of male voices than to female ones. She noted it and said nothing about it to anyone. The ranch hands did not know what to make of her. They were not unkind exactly, but they treated her the way people treat an unusual piece of furniture that has been placed in a room without explanation. They worked around her. They occasionally glanced at her from the corners of their eyes. One of them, a young man named Pete Calder, who could not have been more than 20 and who had the general disposition of a cheerful retriever, asked her on her second day what exactly she was doing just standing there. "Listening," she told him. "To the horse." "To everything," she said. Pete thought about this for a moment and decided it was too complicated for this time of morning and went back to his work. Wesley watched her too, though he was less obvious about it than Pete. She was aware of him the way you are aware of weather, as a presence that had weight and direction, that affected the temperature of the air around it. He was running a ranch. He had 100 things to do that were more pressing than a horse-gentling project, but he appeared at the fence at intervals throughout those first few days in a way that did not quite look like simple oversight. He watched her standing at the rail. He watched her slow, patient stillness. She caught him watching twice, and he did not look away either time, which she found interesting. On the third day, she went into the corral. Not to approach Shadow, just to occupy the same space. She moved to the center of the corral and stood with her back to the horse, which she knew would surprise him because every other human being who had entered this space had faced him, had come toward him, had brought with them the forward pressure of pursuit. She brought none of that. She simply stood, her weight even on both feet, her eyes low, and she waited. Shadow circled her for 40 minutes. She could feel him behind her, hear the changes in his breathing, the gradual slowing of his circling pattern. She did not turn. She did not react when he came close enough that she could feel the heat of him, when she could hear the specific soft sound of his nostril testing her scent. She heard someone along the fence rail say in a low voice, "What in the world is she doing?" And then someone else tell him to be quiet. She thought the second voice might have been Wesley's. On the 5th day, Shadow came and stood behind her with his nose at her left shoulder. He blew a long, slow breath against the back of her neck, which was the horse's way of saying, in language as plain as speech, that he was willing to consider her. She allowed herself one very small, very private smile. By the end of the 2nd week, she could move freely through the corral and Shadow would track her with curiosity rather than alarm. She had begun touching him, starting at his shoulder where horses feel least threatened, and working slowly, methodically, never pushing past the point of his tolerance, always stopping before he asked her to. The ranch hands had stopped pretending not to watch. They would lean against the fence during their breaks and observe with expressions ranging from baffled to genuinely fascinated. Pete Calder had begun holding his breath at certain critical moments in a way that was transparently obvious and which Virginia found endearing. Cole Hatcher watched too, and his expression was harder to read. It contained something that was slowly, reluctantly, converting from skepticism to something else. He had too much pride to call it admiration yet, but it was heading in that direction whether he liked it or not. And Wesley watched. He found himself watching more than he strictly needed to, more than the investment of $25 could justify, more than professional curiosity could fully explain. He had hired dozens of people over the years. He had watched plenty of skilled workers do their jobs. This was different. He was not entirely sure yet what made it different, and that uncertainty sat in his chest with an unusual weight that he paid attention to and then deliberately set aside and paid attention to again, and then set aside again. She was efficient in her movements in a way that had nothing to do with speed. She wasted nothing. Every gesture she made with the horse was precise and considered, and came from a place of deep knowledge that he found himself wanting to understand better. And when she was standing at the rail between sessions, lost in thought, with the Nevada evening light turning the dusk gold around her, and her hat pushed back on her head, and her eyes on the middle distance where Shadow was grazing, she looked like something he did not have good language for. He was 32 years old, and he was not a man who lacked for language. He was also not a man who had time for this particular complication, and he made himself remember that firmly, several times a week, with diminishing success. The complication deepened in the 3rd week. He had come out to the corral later than usual one evening, after the hands had gone in for supper, and found Virginia still there. Not working with Shadow, just sitting on the top fence rail, her notebook open on her knee, writing. She heard him coming and looked up without surprise, as if she had known he would arrive eventually and had been comfortable waiting. "You keep a journal about the horse?" he asked, nodding at the notebook. "Notes," she said. "Observations." What his response was, "What I'll try differently tomorrow." She paused. "My father taught me that if you can't write down what you learned today in a clear sentence, you probably don't understand it as well as you think you do." He came and stood by the rail. Shadow, 20 feet away, glanced up at him and then went back to grazing, which was itself a sign of significant progress. 3 weeks ago the Stallion would have gone to the far side of the corral the moment Wesley appeared. "Your father was a horseman?" Wesley asked. "He was a lot of things," Virginia said. "Good at most of them." A pause. not good at knowing when to trust the wrong people. He heard what was under that. The land situation in Cook County was not a secret. Doyle Marsh had been working his particular brand of quiet predation on small ranchers for a decade, and everyone in the area knew the pattern even when they could not prove it in the way courts required. Elias Reed had not been the first and would not be the last. "How much time do you have left on the note?" Wesley asked. She looked at him steadily. "About 5 weeks. And $25 will do it. 25 will get me close enough to borrow the rest from the territorial bank if I can show them I have an asset and a means of payment." A small, dry smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "They won't lend to a woman without collateral. The horse is the collateral I can show them." He stood in silence for a moment. The evening had gone deep blue at the edges of the sky, and the first stars were appearing above the ridge to the east. "If you need more time on the project," he said carefully, "that's not an issue on my side." She looked at him, and something in that look did something complicated to the region of his sternum. "Thank you," she said, simply and without performance, and went back to her notes. He walked back to the house in the evening quiet, and he was honest enough with himself to admit that the thing in his chest had not decreased in weight. If anything, it had gotten heavier, in the way that something valuable gets heavier when you understand what it is. The trouble with Doyle Marsh did not stay at the edges of the story. On a Thursday morning in the 4th week, Virginia came out to the corral to find a man she did not recognize waiting by the gate. He was dressed too well for the ranch, in a coat that had not seen trail dust, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who make their living by being patient in the way that a trap is patient. He introduced himself as Gerald Crane, which meant nothing to her until he added that he worked for Marsh Cattle and Land Holdings. "Mr. Marsh is aware that you're working here," Crane said, with a pleasantness that had no warmth inside it. "He wanted you to know that the terms on your father's note are firm. He also wanted you to know that he would be willing to renegotiate in the right circumstances." Virginia kept her face very still. "What circumstances?" Crane smiled. "If you were to cease working at this property and remove yourself from Cook County for a period of, say, 1 year, Mr. Marsh would be willing to extend your note by 6 months, interest-free." She understood the shape of it immediately. Marsh wanted her gone because she was working, because she was making progress, because a woman who could pay off her father's debt and reclaim her land was a problem for the system he had built. The system worked because people did not fight it. She was fighting it, and that made her dangerous. "Tell Mr. Marsh," Virginia said with that same pleasantness that had no warmth in it, "that I appreciate his offer and I decline it, and that I'll be paying off my father's note in full before the deadline." Crane looked at her for a long moment. "That would be a mistake, Miss Reed." "That would be my mistake to make," she said, and she turned and walked to the corral gate. She did not mention the visit to anyone until that evening, when she came to supper at the ranch house, as had become her habit over the past 2 weeks. Bet had begun setting a place for her without being asked, which was Bet's way of saying something that Bet would never say out loud. Virginia had come to appreciate Bet's manner of communication. She mentioned Crane's visit quietly to Wesley over the meal, not in alarm, but because it was information he ought to have about activity on his property. She watched his jaw tighten as she spoke. "Marsh sent someone here," he said, and it was not quite a question. "He did. What did you tell him?" "No." Wesley set down his fork. He was quiet for a moment in the way that men are quiet when something cold and clear has settled over their thinking. "Marsh has been working ranchers in this county for years," he said. "He's not going to let it go at one visit." "I know," she said. "You're going to need to move fast." "I know that too." She met his eyes. "Shadow is close. I think I'll be ready to try a saddle within the week." "Virginia." He said her name, not Miss Reed, for the first time, and she noticed it and kept her expression level. "If there's anything you need, resources, time, whatever it is." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and the thing that moved between them in that moment was as real as anything she had ever felt, and as frightening as the note on her father's land, and as beautiful as the Nevada night outside the window. She looked at it directly because she did not look away from difficult things. "I know where to ask," she said. She put the saddle blanket on Shadow on a Wednesday, 3 weeks and 4 days into the project. It took 2 hours. She folded it and placed it on his back by degrees, letting him feel the weight and the texture, letting him stand in it, move in it, understand that it was not a threat. Shadow trembled the first time it settled fully on his back, every muscle going rigid with the old familiar panic, and Virginia stood at his shoulder and talked to him in a low, continuous voice, not words that meant anything in particular, but sound that meant that she was there and she was calm and she was not going to hurt him. The trembling stopped. When she led him out of the corral wearing the blanket, 3 ranch hands who had been trying very hard to look like they were doing other things gave up entirely and just stood there watching with their mouths open. Pete Calder said, under his breath but not quietly enough, "I will be danged." She heard Wesley from somewhere behind her, and when she glanced back he was standing outside the barn door, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before. She had seen him professional, she had seen him thoughtful, she had seen him sharp with calculation and soft at the edges with the kind of humor he deployed rarely and quietly. She had not seen him look like this. He was watching her with Shadow, and on his face was something that looked like awe, simple and undisguised, the kind that gets through before a person has a chance to put their armor back on. She turned back to Shadow before he could see her smile. 2 days later, she put the saddle on. It was the moment she had been building toward for weeks, and she had planned it carefully. The saddle itself she had borrowed from the tack room, a lighter working saddle that sat differently than the heavy cavalry gear Peterson's men had apparently tried to force onto Shadow in the early days. She introduced the girth slowly, letting him smell it, letting him feel the contact, watching for the precise point at which tolerance would shift to fear and stopping before that point, always before it. It took most of the morning. By midday, Shadow was standing in the corral with the saddle sitting fully on his back, the girth snug but not tight, and he was eating grain from her hand. The ranch had been accumulating around the corral rails all morning. Everyone found reasons to be working near the breaking corral. Bet appeared at some point carrying a pot of coffee and distributed cups with the efficiency of someone who had decided this was now a community event and was catering it accordingly. Cole Hatcher stood at the end of the rail nearest the gate with his arms crossed and his expression revealing, very slowly and against his visible will, the fact that he was completely out of arguments. And then came the morning that the story had been building toward since Virginia Reed first laid her hand on the gate. The next day, in the early light before the ranch was fully awake, Virginia came to the corral alone. This was her way. The early morning was when a horse was most receptive, when the world was quiet and the clamor of other human energy had not yet begun. She had been coming early every day since the 2nd week. But this morning was different and she knew it, and the knowledge sat in her like a steady, slow flame. She entered the corral. She saddled Shadow with the calm, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times now. She checked the girth. She checked the stirrups. She stood at his left side for a long moment, her hand on his neck, feeling the fine tremor of readiness in him, the energy that was not fear anymore but something more like anticipation. She put her foot in the stirrup. She swung up. Shadow stood absolutely still for the space of 3 heartbeats. Then he moved, and the movement was not a buck or a bolt. It was a test, a collected, powerful step forward, feeling the weight on his back, feeling her balance, processing this new reality with the intelligence of an animal that was far cleverer than anyone had given him credit for. She moved with him, her seat deep and still, her hands soft on the reins, her balance perfect. Shadow walked a full circle around the corral. He was not broken. He was not defeated. He was, for the first time in his life, choosing. Virginia kept her breathing even and her hands quiet and let him choose. That was when Wesley came. He had seen the light from his window and come down earlier than usual, with the half-formed thought that he wanted to see how Shadow was doing with the saddle work. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped so suddenly that the coffee cup in his hand sloshed. Virginia Reed was on the back of the black stallion, walking him in calm circles around the corral, the early morning light turning the whole scene gold and clean and perfectly quiet. The horse's neck was curved. His feet fell with precision, and Virginia sat him with the kind of ease that does not come from practice alone. That comes from a conversation between a human body and a horse's body that has been built over weeks of patient, intelligent, deeply committed work. Wesley stood and he watched, and the shock of it moved through him in waves. He had genuinely believed she would not manage it. Not because she had not seemed capable, but because he had watched men far more experienced fail with this horse, and the difference between his belief in her ability and his certainty that the horse was ungentleable had been a quiet, private tension in his chest for weeks. He had told himself he was giving her a chance because he was a fair man, because she had asked intelligently, because her logic about the methods had been sound. He had not let himself fully believe. Standing here now, watching her on the back of the horse that had put two of his best wranglers in the dirt, he understood something about the space between his skepticism and her capability, and it was not a comfortable understanding. The discomfort of it was real and honest, and he did not try to soften it. He had been wrong, not entirely wrong, not wrong in a way that had prevented her success, but wrong in the private place where he had not quite believed. The admission of it felt like something necessary and important. He must have made a sound, or Shadow caught his scent, because the horse swiveled one ear in his direction and Virginia looked over. She was still on his back. Shadow had not reacted to Wesley's presence with flight. He had simply noted it. That, too, was extraordinary. Virginia looked at Wesley across the corral in the morning light and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The horse beneath her was saying it. He set his coffee cup on the fence post and just stood there, and when he finally spoke his voice had something in it that she had not heard before. "Virginia," he said. $25, she said, but there was a smile under it, quiet and real. He laughed, and it was not the rare, controlled humor she had seen from him before. It was a full laugh, surprised out of him, and it changed his face in a way that caught her completely off guard and made her look away at Shadow's ears for a moment to give herself somewhere to put her own expression. Cole Hatcher came around the barn at a run, drawn by the sound of his boss laughing, which was an event worthy of attention by any measure, and he saw what was happening and stopped with one hand braced on the fence and stared. Then he looked at Wesley, then back at Virginia on the horse. "I've been working with horses for 17 years, Cole Hatcher said, in a voice stripped of everything except the pure fact of what he was witnessing. "I have never seen anything like that." Virginia walked Shadow over to the fence rail where they were standing. She reached down and unhooked her boot from the left stirrup and dismounted with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, and she stood with her hand on Shadow's neck while the horse regarded Wesley and Cole with calm curiosity. Wesley reached out his hand slowly to Shadow's nose. Shadow breathed on it, did not move away. Wesley looked at Virginia. She was watching him with those clear, steady eyes, and there was something in them that she was not yet willing to put words to, but it was there, and he could see it, and the sight of it did something permanent to him. "Come up to the house," he said. "I'll get your money, and there are some things I'd like to talk with you about." What he wanted to talk with her about was Doyle Marsh. He had been doing some quiet investigating since Crane's visit to his ranch. Wesley Brenner was a man with connections, not flashy connections, not the kind that came from money thrown around in saloons, but the kind that came from 18 years of running an honest operation and treating people fairly, which meant that people owed him goodwill in a currency that spent better than dollars in certain situations. What he had learned was that Marsh's operation was more vulnerable than it appeared. The promissory note on the Reed land contained a specific technical clause about the method of repayment, a clause that Elias Reed had almost certainly not understood when he signed, that Marsh's people had included deliberately to create complications if the debt was ever paid. The clause required repayment in the form of a bank draft from a Nevada territorial institution. Not cash, not a personal note, not anything except that specific instrument. The territorial bank in the county seat had a practice, quiet but consistent, of declining to issue bank drafts to female customers for amounts over $100 without a male cosigner. It was not a written policy. It was simply what they did, and Marsh knew this. He had built his whole strategy around it. Virginia listened to all of this with her hands flat on Wesley's kitchen table and her face very still. He set it up so that even if I earned the money, I couldn't pay it in the form he required, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then how did you find this out? I know the man who does Marsh's title work. He was Elias Reed's age. He has a daughter. Wesley paused. He didn't like this one. Virginia looked at him. You asked him to look. I asked him to look. She felt something shift in the landscape of how she understood him. This was not charity. This was not pity. This was a man who had identified a hidden threat to someone he respected and had used his own resources to expose it without being asked, without announcing it, with the specific quiet competence that she had begun to recognize as his particular brand of strength. What do I do about the bank draft? She asked. You can use my name on the account, he said, as a business arrangement. You have earned the right to that stallion's worth through your work here. I can put that in writing, which gives you an asset held under both our names, which the bank will accept. You pay the draft from that account, the note clears, the land reverts to you free. She looked at him for a long time. Why? He met her gaze. Because it's right, he said, and because your father built that land from nothing over 18 years and a man like Marsh doesn't get to take it through a trick in the paperwork. She looked at him steadily. And because he was quiet for just long enough that the silence had weight. And because I would like the chance to know you better, he said carefully, and I would find it considerably harder to do that if you left Cook County. It was the most honest thing she had seen a man say in a very long time. She said, I think I would like that too. The business arrangement with the bank was formalized within a week. Wesley's name on the account created no issues. Shadow's value, assessed by a livestock man from Carson City who came out to the Brenner spread and stood at the corral rail for approximately 30 seconds before naming a figure that made Pete Calder's eyes go wide, was more than enough to secure the bank draft. Virginia paid off the note on a Tuesday afternoon with the kind of composure that looks like calm from the outside, and on the inside is a person holding very still so they do not cry in front of a man who has spent years profiting from the suffering of others. Doyle Marsh was not present. He had sent a clerk. The clerk processed the payment with a face as empty as a window with the shutters pulled. The land was hers. She rode home that afternoon on her gray mare, across the 30 miles of sage and dust and open sky that she had ridden so many times before, and this time when she came over the rise and saw her father's house below with the glass windows catching the late light, she sat her horse for a full minute and simply let herself feel the full weight of what it meant. She had done it. Not alone, a fact she held clearly and without discomfort. She had done it with the help of a man who had seen what she was and had chosen to stand in her corner not because she needed rescuing, but because he was the kind of man who recognized real strength and wanted to be near it. She thought about Wesley Brenner for most of the ride home. There was a problem with thinking about Wesley Brenner, which was that the more she thought about him, the more there was to think about. The specific quality of his attention when she spoke, the way he listened with his whole body, not the performative nodding of a man waiting to respond, but the actual stillness of someone absorbing what was being said and turning it over in his mind before answering. The way he ran his ranch, with a care for the people who worked it and the animals in his charge and the land itself that struck her as essentially the same quality she had seen in her father at his best. The way he had looked at her on the morning she rode Shadow for the first time, with that shock of genuine awe that had come through before his defenses reassembled, and which she had filed away very carefully in the most private part of her memory. She got home, put up her mare, walked into her father's house, and stood in the kitchen that smelled like sage and old wood, and she was home, and she was safe, and the note was paid, and she was 22 years old and alone, and that last fact sat in the kitchen with her in a way it had not sat before. She was not a woman who was afraid of solitude. She had built most of her interior life in solitude, and she valued it. But she was honest with herself, and the honesty told her that the particular solitude of an empty kitchen at the end of a significant day had a different weight than the solitude she had always known how to carry. She thought about Wesley Brenner's eyes in the lamplight. She thought about the fact that he had said he wanted to know her better. She thought about it for a long time. 3 days later, he came to her. He rode up on the roan he favored, unannounced in the late morning, and she saw him coming from the distance and kept working on the fence post she was setting, because she did not want to look like she had been expecting him, even though a part of her had been. He came up and dismounted and tied his roan to her fence and stood there for a moment watching her work. She had a post-hole digger and her arms were dusty to the elbow, and there was nothing particularly graceful about the work, and she did not care. "You're fixing fence," he said. "The north corner section came down over winter and I haven't had time to get to it." She set the post-hole digger aside and straightened up. "I didn't expect you. I should have sent word ahead." He took his hat off. That was interesting. He was not a hatch-removing man except at table and indoors. "I wanted to ask you something." She waited. "The Stallion," he said. "Shadow, he's yours if you want him." She went very still. "Wesley, you gentled him. You built whatever it is you built with that horse. That belongs to you, not to me. I bought the horse, but I never tamed him, and you did something I'm not sure anyone else in 3 territories could have done, and it wouldn't sit right with me to sell him or use him like a piece of ranch stock when he's—" He paused, and the pause had something genuine in it. "When he's what he is now because of who you are." She looked at him for a long moment, standing in the dust of her father's north pasture with his hat in his hands, and the Nevada sky enormous behind him, and his expression as honest as anything she had ever seen. "That's a very expensive gift," she said. "It's not a gift, it's yours by right." A pause. "I also came because I'd like to invite you to supper at the Brenner Ranch on Saturday, not as an employee, as my guest." He stopped, and the stop was careful and deliberate, and she understood that he was a man who used his words with precision and was choosing them with particular care right now. "As a woman I would like to court, with your permission and on your own terms." The afternoon was very quiet. A hawk turned overhead. The roan shifted its weight and blew a breath. "On my own terms," she said. "Yes." She had been proposed to once before, at 19, by a man from the valley who had a good enough face and a mediocre mind, and who had made the error of explaining to her, early in their acquaintance, that a wife of his wouldn't need to concern herself with the management of the property. He would handle all of that. She had thanked him politely and declined, and had heard for 6 months afterward from various people in town that she was too particular for her own good and would end up alone. She had decided, at 19, that ending up alone was a better option than ending up with the wrong person. She had held that position through the intervening 3 years without finding a reason to revise it. Wesley Brenner was providing a reason. "Saturday," she said. "Yes." The courtship that followed was not the courtship she would have designed from scratch, because it was more complicated and more frightening and more alive than anything she could have planned. She had been so careful for so long, had kept the door between her exterior capability and her interior self so firmly managed, that allowing someone access to the interior was like learning to ride a new horse all over again, requiring patience, requiring nerve. But Wesley was patient, and he had more nerve than most men she had encountered, and he was, more than anything else, genuinely interested in her. Not in the version of her that was impressive and capable and useful, though he admired those things openly and without condescension. In her. In the specific architecture of her mind, the particular quality of her humor, the ideas she had about the land and horses and the territory and the sky and the nature of strength. They talked for hours on Saturday, at his table with bets cooking between them and the lamp turned low, and then on the porch afterward in the warm Nevada night, and then sitting on the fence rail by Shadow's corral, because that was the place that felt most natural to both of them. And by the time she rode home, it was nearly midnight, and she had told him things she had not said aloud in years. About her father. About the fear she had felt when the note came due, and the way that fear had converted, over those first cold mornings, into a specific kind of determination that she had learned to recognize in herself as her best quality and her most reliable resource. About what she wanted from the land and from her life in it. About the way she had understood, standing in that corral with Shadow in those first impossible days, that the only way to change a damaged thing was to offer it something consistent and true and wait for it to decide. Wesley listened. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that could only be asked by someone who had been listening carefully and had identified the thing she had not quite said. He told her his own things in return, about his father, about the land and what it cost him to run it well, about the years after his father died when the weight of 800 head of cattle and 30,000 acres and the livelihood of a dozen families had settled on his 26-year-old shoulders, and he had been in private, more frightened than he had ever let anyone see. "I think being frightened and doing the work anyway is not a character flaw," Virginia said. "No," he agreed. "I think it's the definition of character." They were quiet together after that, the comfortable quiet of people who do not need to fill silence, and the stars were immense above them, and Shadow moved softly in his corral nearby, and Virginia Reed thought, with a clarity that was both frightening and true, that she was falling in love. She tried not to rush it. She was a patient person, as evidenced by everything she had done with the horse, and she understood that the most important things required time to become what they were supposed to be. She came to the Brenner Ranch on Saturdays and sometimes on Tuesday evenings, and Wesley came to her place when he could manage it, which was not as often because his operation required more of him than hers currently required of her. But every visit had the quality of something carefully tended, growing steadily in the direction of light. The trouble came back, as she had known it would. Doyle Marsh was not a man who accepted outcomes he had not authorized. The payment of the note on the Reed land had cost him not only that particular parcel, but a degree of confidence in the system he had built, because word traveled in Cook County, and people were beginning to understand that the notes were not as inescapable as Marsh wanted them to believe. This made Virginia a problem that had not gone away. It had grown. She became aware of it in small ways first. Fences on her south border that she was certain she had not damaged appeared cut. A payment she was expecting from the sale of 2 horses she had broken for a neighbor somehow became delayed by a bank error that the bank, when she went to ask about it, could not quite explain. These were not accidents. They were the fingerprints of a man who was patient in the way that a trap is patient, who had decided that if the legal mechanism had failed, other mechanisms would be applied. She told Wesley. He was quiet in that way he had, the cold and clear way that meant he was thinking rather than reacting, and when he looked up his eyes were very still. "I want you to come here," he said, "not as a guest, as a resident. I want you to bring what you need from your father's house and stay on this property where I can see you." She understood the impulse, and she appreciated the concern behind it, and she also knew herself well enough to understand the answer. "If I run from my land, I lose it in a different way than if he takes it," she said. "I'm not running, Wesley." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then let me help you in a way that doesn't require you to run." "What way?" "I know the county sheriff," he said. "I know the federal land office representative who comes through twice a year. I know the editor of the Elko paper, which covers the whole region. And Marsh's practice of acquiring land through these predatory notes is a pattern that can be documented and exposed, which is a different kind of threat to him than any individual paying off any individual note." He paused. "But I need your help doing it. I need your documentation. Your records of what happened with your father's note, the crane visit, the fence cutting, the payment interference, all of it written and dated." She thought about it. "You're building a case." "I'm building a case." She looked at him with the full force of her attention. "When did you start working on this?" "When Crane came to my property," he said simply. "I don't like men who operate through hidden motives and traps built into paperwork. I don't like it when they operate on my land, and I especially don't like it when they operate against someone I care about." Someone I care about. He had said it plainly, without decoration, in the voice he used for true things. She cared about him. The truth of that sat in her chest like the warmth of a good fire, steady and real. "I have everything documented," she said. "I always document." He smiled. "I know," he said. "You taught me that." They built the case together over the next 6 weeks, working at her kitchen table and at his, passing documents back and forth, Virginia's precise handwriting filling pages that laid out the Reed land note in full detail, the method of payment clause, the way the bank's practice would have prevented her from meeting that clause without outside assistance. They had testimony from Marsh's own title man, who put his account in writing. They had 2 other families in the county who had been through the same mechanism, and who, when Virginia rode to see them personally, woman to rancher, with a directness and dignity that could not be dismissed, agreed to add their voices. The editor of the Elko paper came down on a Wednesday. He was a small, sharp-featured man named Harcourt who had a newsman's nose for the architecture of corruption, and who read Virginia's documentation with an expression of increasing satisfaction. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Miss Reed, this is the clearest case of systematic land fraud I have seen in 8 years of covering this territory." "Will you print it?" she asked. "I'll print it prominently," Harcourt said, "with full documentation cited. Marsh will try to suppress it. He won't succeed. He doesn't have the kind of friends in the right places that he thinks he has." The story ran in the Elko Independent on a Thursday in late October of 1878. It covered the front page and half of the second, under a headline that named Doyle Marsh and his company directly, and laid out the pattern of predatory notes in language that was factual, precise, and devastating. The legal response came within a month. 3 families filed formal complaints with the Federal Land Office. Marsh's operation was investigated. The investigation found what it found, because Virginia's documentation was thorough and irrefutable, because the other families had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, because truth that has been carefully and patiently assembled into a clear and documented form is very difficult to argue with. Doyle Marsh was not imprisoned. This was 1878, and the mechanisms of frontier justice were imperfect, particularly when applied to men with money. But he was fined, his practice was formally censured, and the Land Office put his entire portfolio of notes under review, which effectively ended his ability to operate as he had been operating. He left Cook County within the year and moved his operation to another territory, where Virginia hoped, without quite believing, that someone else would eventually do what she had done. She had her land, clean and clear and hers. She stood on her porch on the morning after the legal resolution came through and looked at the Ruby Mountains to the north, and the Sage Flats rolling out to the south and the sky above all of it, enormous and particular, and she felt the weight of what had been accomplished settle into her like water soaking into dry ground. And she felt something else too. The land was hers. Her life here was solid and real, and something she had built and defended with her own intelligence and her own work, and the help of a man who had treated her capability as the given that it was. She had everything she needed. She also knew that she wanted more than everything she needed. She wanted the full life. She wanted Saturday evenings and the specific quality of someone's quiet in the room beside her, and the permanence of choosing someone and being chosen in return. She wanted Wesley Brenner with a directness and a certainty that was entirely consistent with the way she had always wanted things, without apology and without disguise. He came to see her that Sunday. He came later in the day than usual, in the late afternoon when the light was going honey-colored, and he looked, when he arrived, like a man who had been thinking hard about something for a long time and had made up his mind about it, and was now implementing the decision with the particular intentionality of someone who does not do important things carelessly. They sat on the porch. They talked about the resolution, about the families that would keep their land, about what the territory looked like without Marsh operating in it. And then there was a quiet between them, and in the quiet, Wesley turned toward her with his whole body, the way he did when something mattered. "Virginia," he said. She waited. "I have been in love with you since the morning I watched you ride that horse in the early light," he said. "And probably before that, if I'm honest, which I try to be." He paused. "I'd like to ask you to marry me. I want to be clear about what that means from my side. It means your land stays yours. It means your work is your work and your name is your name. Virginia Reed Brenner if you want it that way, Reed only if you prefer it. It means I want to build something with you that is made of the same things you are made of, which is patience and intelligence, and a kind of courage I have never seen in anyone else." Another pause, and under the precision of his words she could hear the undeniable truth of a man who was fully, vulnerably present. "It means I love you." She had been looking at him throughout all of this, and she did not look away now. She looked at him directly, the way she had always looked at difficult things, and this was not a difficult thing. It was the clearest thing she had encountered in a long time. "Yes," she said. He reached out and took her hand, and his hand was warm and certain, and she held it with her own certainty, and they sat on her father's porch in the evening light with the mountains to the north and the sage everywhere and the sky turning colors she did not have adequate words for, and the life that was waiting for them had the quality of the best kind of open country. Enormous, true, ready to be ridden. They married in early spring of 1879, in the chapel in Holt's Crossing that had been built the year before Virginia was born. Bet cried, which she denied when anyone mentioned it afterward, and Cole Hatcher shook Virginia's hand with a grip that communicated about 6 months' worth of reluctant admiration that he had never said out loud, and now never needed to. Pete Calder managed to tip over a flower arrangement during the reception, and then stood in the aftermath of it with an expression of such genuine mortification that the whole room laughed, including Virginia, and including Wesley, who had never looked so unguarded and unreservedly happy in his life. Shadow was kept at the Brenner Ranch, because it made the most logistical sense, but he was Virginia's horse in every meaningful way. She rode him in the mornings, the long early rides she had always taken and which she now took over the combined land of both properties, the reed pastures to the south and the Brenner Range to the north, an expanse of country that under her eye and Wesley's became what both of them separately had always wanted it to be: healthy land, good cattle, horses that were treated as the intelligent animals they were. They combined the operations formally in the summer of 1879, which required more paperwork than either of them had anticipated, and which Virginia handled with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. Wesley watched her work through a stack of documents one evening at the kitchen table and said, with the particular quiet humor that she had come to love most about him, that he was very glad she was on his side. She looked up from the documents and said, "You should be," and he grinned, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Nevada night was going dark and cool and full of stars. She found out she was pregnant in October of 1879. She told Wesley on a Tuesday evening when he came in from a late day with the cattle, and she watched the information travel across his face in real time, the initial blankness of a man processing something unexpected, followed by something so warm and so real that it made her eyes fill in a way that almost nothing else did. He sat down at the table and took both her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible. No armor, no management, just the full weight of the man she had married loving her with his complete attention. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, and she loved him for it, for making that the first thing. "Perfectly well," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said equally honestly, "and extremely happy, both at the same time." "That seems about right," she said. The pregnancy was a good one, which she was grateful for in a territory where medicine was limited and outcomes were not guaranteed. She was healthy and practical, and she kept working through most of it, which scandalized Bet into a running low-level commentary on the subject that Virginia listened to with the patient affection she had developed for Bet's manner of expressing concern. Their son was born in June of 1880. They named him Elias for her father, and Wesley never suggested any other name. Virginia held her son in the room that had been made ready for him, with the Nevada summer outside the window and Wesley's hand warm in hers, and she looked at this new person who was made of the two of them, and she felt the full weight of a life that had come through fear and loss and the particular darkness of a trap set in paperwork, and had arrived here, at this, warm and breathing and entirely and permanently hers. Little Elias Reed Brenner grew with the particular determination of a child who has been wished into existence by two people who had both fought for what they believed in. He had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and an opinion about everything from the age he could form words to express one, which was early. Virginia watched him with the horses from infancy, holding him at the corral rail where Shadow would come to investigate with a delicacy that still amazed the hands who remembered what this horse had been. 2 years later they had a daughter, Clara, who arrived in August of 1882 with a voice that carried considerably further than her 6-pound frame would suggest, and who from her earliest days showed an absolute lack of fear regarding anything that walked or moved on the Brenner ranch. Wesley watched Clara reach fearlessly toward Shadow's nose on her 2nd birthday while standing on the fence rail with her father's hand steadying her waist, and he looked at Virginia with an expression she recognized. He was seeing in his daughter the same quality he had first seen in her mother on a May morning in 1878, standing at a corral gate while every man in the yard told her to step back. "She's yours," Virginia said, watching him watch their daughter. "She's yours," he said. "God help us all." Virginia laughed, and the laugh was the kind that came from somewhere deep and secure, from a woman who had built her life on honest ground with her own hands and her own mind, and the partnership of a man who understood the difference between protecting someone and respecting them. Shadow lived on the Brenner Ranch until 1887, 11 years old and the finest working horse in 3 counties, a reputation he carried with the same quality he had always had, a kind of sovereign, considered intelligence that everyone who encountered him remembered afterward. Virginia rode him until the end, through 2 pregnancies and the changes of seasons and the work and the good years, and the one hard year when they lost cattle to a drought that burned the summer brown, and Shadow carried her through all of it with the trust that had been built in a corral in 1878 by a quiet woman who had known how to listen. When he died peacefully in the early morning of a September, Virginia was with him. She sat with him in the quiet and she told him what he had meant, and she knew he heard her in whatever way a horse hears such things, in the quality of presence and the steadiness of a voice that had always meant safety to him. She came in when the sun was fully up and Wesley was in the kitchen with the children, Elias 7 and Clara 5 and a new baby, another son they would name Thomas, 4 months old in the cradle near the fire. Wesley looked at her face when she came through the door and he did not ask. He just rose and came to her and put his arms around her, and she let him, because that was the other thing she had learned in these years, that letting someone hold you was not the same as being held down. They stood in the kitchen in the morning light, the full and particular life of them surrounding and contained within those 4 walls, and Virginia Reed Brenner pressed her face into her husband's shoulder for just a moment, and then straightened up and looked at her children and at the morning through the window and said to no one in particular, "Well." And that was enough. That was exactly enough. In the years that followed, the Brenner Ranch became known for 2 things with equal reputation in the county and beyond. The cattle operation, which was as sound and well-managed as it had ever been, now expanded to over 1,000 head and staffed with men who knew they were working for a fair outfit. And the horses. Virginia had never stopped working with difficult horses. It was not a project she planned to stop. It was simply what she did, the way some people fish or play fiddle or tend elaborate gardens. She had a knowledge in her hands and in her understanding that was not learned from any book but was deeply and specifically hers, built from years of patience and attention, and the willingness to listen to something that spoke in a different language than the one most people used. Word had gotten around after Shadow. Word always gets around in frontier communities, moving along the same lines of connection and communication that allowed gossip and trouble to travel, but which also, occasionally, carried something worth carrying. Ranchers from 2 and then 3 counties began bringing problem horses to the Brenner spread. Not all of them, and not a formal operation, but the ones who had heard and believed the story of the Black Stallion and who had an animal they could not otherwise manage. Virginia took them one at a time, on her own schedule with her own methods, and the success rate was the kind that builds a reputation that cannot be argued with. She wrote things down in the notebooks she had been keeping since she was 14, the careful, specific observations about pressure and release and trust, and the language that passed between a human body and an animal body when both were paying attention. Elias, when he was 9, found a stack of these notebooks in her workroom and spent a whole afternoon reading them with the focused absorption of a child encountering something that matches the shape of their own interior life. He came to find her afterward where she was working fence on the east pasture and said, with the directness that she recognized as her own quality showing through his inheritance of it, "Mama, you should teach this." She looked at him. He was 9 years old with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and a certainty that sat easily on him. "I do teach it," she said. "I'm teaching it to you. To everyone," he said. "Other people should know." She thought about it over the following weeks. Then she talked to Wesley about it as she talked to him about everything important. He listened in the way he always listened, fully and without his own agenda displacing hers, and when she finished he said, "You've known that for a while. You were waiting until you believed it was worth other people's time." She looked at him. "Was that obvious?" "To me," he said simply. "She wrote a manual." She did not call it a manual. She called it a field guide, a working document for anyone dealing with horses that had experienced fear-based trauma, which was a concept she laid out in language so clear and practical that a working ranch hand could read it without a university education and understand it fully. The first copies were printed by Harcourt's Paper in Elko, who had maintained the friendly professional connection since 1878, and who greeted the project with the same focused satisfaction he had brought to the Marsh Exposé. The field guide circulated. Slowly at first, the way true things circulate, not with a splash but with a steady, accumulating presence that grows because it is useful and keeps being useful. By the mid-1880s, copies were in use on ranches from the Utah border to the California line. Virginia received letters which she answered. She was meticulous about answering letters. She was 41 years old when she received a letter from a woman in Colorado who had read the field guide and had used it to gentle a horse that 3 male trainers had declared unworkable, and who wanted Virginia to know that the methods were sound. She had tested them herself, and that the quiet observation in the guide's opening pages, that the most important thing you can bring to a frightened animal is your own honest calm, had changed the way she thought about more things than just horses. Virginia read this letter twice. Then she put it in the box she kept for letters that she reread when she needed them, and she went to find Wesley. He was in the office, doing what he was usually doing when she found him in the office, working through figures with the focused patience of a man who understood that a well-run operation required consistent attention to the unglamorous details that made everything else possible. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. When he looked up, His eyes had the quality they had on the morning she first rode Shadow, that unguarded warmth that was the truest version of him. "This is good," he said. "Yes," she said, "you knew it was good when you wrote it." "I hoped," she said. "There's a difference." He set the letter down and looked at her with the particular attention he had always given her, the kind that saw all of it, the capable exterior and the interior that was less certain and more complicated and entirely his. "Virginia Reed," he said. She smiled at the use of her maiden name, which he did occasionally, not to diminish the name they shared but to acknowledge where she had come from, the quiet rancher's daughter who everyone had underestimated, who had stood at a gate in the spring of 1878 with a whole territory telling her to step back. "You were always going to be exactly this," he said. She crossed the room and she kissed him, in the afternoon light of their shared office, in the house that was hers and his and their children's, on the land that she had refused to lose, and the kiss carried in it everything that had accumulated between them across the years. The corral in the early morning, the kitchen table in the lamplight, the porch in the evening, the children, the work, the trust that had been built slowly and honestly and that was, by now, as solid and permanent as the Ruby Mountains to the north. She pulled back and looked at him. He was older now as she was older. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and silver in his hair, and he was more himself than he had ever been, the way people become more themselves as the years confirm what was always essentially true. "We should go check on Thomas," she said. "He was attempting to climb the fence again when I came in." "He comes by that honestly," Wesley said. "He does," she agreed, and she took his hand and they went out together into the afternoon of their life, the sky enormous and particular above the Brenner ranch, the sage running out to the horizon in every direction, the Ruby Mountains standing as they always had and would, permanent and indifferent to the small human stories that took place in their shadow. But this story was not small. It never had been. It was the story of a quiet rancher's daughter who had been dismissed, set aside, underestimated, and redirected by a world that did not know what to do with the specific quality of her intelligence and her nerve, who had stood at a gate while men told her to step back and had stepped forward instead, who had built trust out of patience and patience out of knowledge and knowledge out of years of watching and listening to things that most people did not slow down enough to hear, who had broken no one, who had broken nothing, who had offered a frightened, damaged, extraordinary animal something consistent and true and waited for him to decide, and who had, in doing so, offered the same thing to a man who was watching from the fence rail with his coffee going cold in his hand, and his heart already in the process of deciding something it would take him months to admit and a lifetime to be grateful for. The Nevada evening came down in its slow, gold, enormous way, the way it had always done and would always do, and Virginia Reed Brenner walked across the yard of her ranch toward the sound of her youngest child's laughter, with her husband's hand in hers, and the whole good weight of a life fully lived settled around her like the warmth of the sun that was going down behind the mountains. She was home. She had always been home. She just had to fight for it, with intelligence and patience and a courage that looked from the outside like quiet. She knew now what it looked like from the inside. It looked like love.